Chinedu had never been a man of wealth, but what he lacked in money, he made up for in ambition and a hard-working spirit. He lived in Surulere, Lagos, in a small one-bedroom flat that barely had enough space for him and his wife, Amara, but within those four walls existed a love that many wealthy homes could not boast of. Their mornings often began with the smell of akra frying in a small pan, or sometimes just Gary soaked with groundnuts when times were tough. Yet, even in those difficult mornings, laughter often echoed through their compound. Amara, a gifted tailor who ran her sewing from a small wooden kiosk by the roadside, always found a way to encourage her husband whenever he came back home looking weary from long hours at the construction firm where he worked as an assistant project officer. Chinedu would slump on the old sofa, his shirt drenched in sweat, his hands rough from handling cement bags and documents alike, and Amara would kneel beside him with a gentle smile, wiping his brow and telling him, "Nkem, one day all this suffering will turn into testimony." It was that kind of love that made their humble beginnings bearable, the kind that planted hope where others would have only seen despair. In the evenings, when the electricity supply finally blinked to life, they would sit outside with neighbors, fanning themselves against the Lagos heat, laughing at jokes, and sometimes dreaming aloud of a small shop for Amara or a promotion for Chinedu. Their love was raw, unpolished, but true. Amara had turned down suitors who promised her cars and trips abroad just to marry Chinedu because she saw something in him, a man with vision, a man who could build a future if given the right chance. Chinedu, on his part, adored Amara deeply in those early years, often calling her his crown, a woman who gave him peace in a city that constantly tried to take it away. It was not a fairy tale life, but it was a foundation of loyalty, sacrifice, and dreams too fragile yet too precious to be toyed with. But as the years passed, life began to weigh heavily on Chinedu's shoulders. Lagos was not a city that showed mercy to dreamers. It was a place where wealth spoke louder than effort, where respect bowed before the power of money. Every time Chinedu boarded the rickety Danfo bus to work, squeezed between traders and students, his mind wandered to the glossy black SUVs he saw glide past on the roads, often carrying men in sharp suits and women dripping in luxury. He longed to be among them, not just one of the countless faces hustling for survival. At first, he buried these thoughts, holding tightly to Amara's words of encouragement, but deep down, a hunger had begun to stir in him, a hunger that simple love could not satisfy. Amara noticed the changes gradually. Chinedu no longer laughed as freely as before. He often sighed heavily when he saw her counting the little money she had made from sewing clothes for neighbors. Sometimes, he would stare at the old ceiling fan as if it were mocking him for still spinning in the same spot after all these years. Still, Amara did not complain. She believed in him, believed that his time would come, and she worked harder to make sure the little they had stretched far enough. She patched his torn shirts neatly, cooked with whatever ingredients she could find, and even gave up small pleasures like jewelry or new wrappers just so they could save. She was the kind of wife who prayed at midnight while her husband slept, asking God to lift him higher. But unbeknownst to her, destiny was already preparing to test the strength of their love in ways she could never imagine. For while Amara was content with their humble beginnings, Chinedu's heart was beginning to crave more, not just for success but for a kind of life that would soon put their marriage on a dangerous path. Chinedu's life took an unexpected turn the day he was summoned into his boss's office. Mr. Okafor, a man of imposing presence with a voice that commanded silence in every room, rarely invited junior staff for private conversations. Chinedu had been nervous as he adjusted his tie and entered the air-conditioned office, the kind of luxury he only experienced on rare occasions. To his surprise, Mr. Okafor did not scold him for errors or demand impossible tasks. Instead, the older man spoke with unusual warmth, praising his diligence and commitment. Chinedu felt a surge of pride, the kind he had long yearned for, but it was what came next that truly unsettled him. Mr. Okafor invited him to a small family dinner that weekend, saying he wanted to introduce him to his household. Chinedu had never been inside the homes of Lagos's elite before, and when he arrived at the palatial residence in Lekki, his breath was stolen by the marble floors, the chandeliers, the fleet of luxury cars parked neatly in the driveway. It was a different world entirely, a world where money spoke without uttering a word. It was at that dinner that Chinedu first met Adanna, Mr. Okafor's only daughter. She was the kind of woman who walked into a room and instantly commanded attention. Tall, fair-skinned, with long manicured nails and a confidence that bordered on arrogance, she carried herself like royalty. When she smiled at Chinedu, it wasn't just politeness, It was an appraisal, a look that lingered too long, one that stirred something deep in him. The contrast between Adanna and Amara struck him immediately. Where Amara's hands were roughened from years of tailoring, Adanna's were smooth and adorned with diamonds. Where Amara dressed modestly in Ankara, Adanna dazzled in designer gowns. And while Amara spoke gently, always encouraging and praying, Adanna's words were bold, witty, and laced with entitlement. That evening, as Chinedu sat at the lavish dining table, tasting meals he had only ever seen on TV, he felt both awe and hunger rising in him. It wasn't just the food or the house, it was the life itself. A life that whispered, "You deserve more." By the time he left, Adanna had made her interest clear in subtle ways, asking about his work, praising his determination, and even joking that a man like him deserved better than a life of struggle. Chinedu laughed nervously, but her words clung to him like perfume he couldn't wash off. That night, as he lay beside Amara in their cramped bed, her arm draped lovingly across his chest, he could not shake the image of Adanna from his mind. The seeds of temptation had been sown, and they were beginning to sprout in dangerous silence. The days that followed only deepened Chinedu's inner conflict. He began to notice more of the things he lacked each time he visited the office. Colleagues who once seemed ordinary now looked more polished, their cars shinier, their clothes more expensive. When he returned home, the contrast with Amara's simple meals and patched clothes struck him more harshly. He no longer saw her sacrifices as acts of love. Instead, he began to see them as reminders of his stagnation. When Amara told him cheerfully about a neighbor who wanted to sew clothes for a wedding, he barely listened, his mind still lingering on Adanna's laughter from the dinner. Soon, invitations to more dinners at Mr. Okafor's house followed, and each time, Adanna grew bolder in her flirtations. She touched his arm lightly as she spoke, teased him in ways that blurred the line between playfulness and seduction, and praised him in front of her father. Mr. Okafor, perhaps deliberately, did not discourage it. In fact, he once remarked offhandedly that any man who married into his family would never know poverty again. Those words haunted Chinedu. At night, while Amara prayed fervently for their breakthrough, he stared at the ceiling, torn between gratitude for the woman who had stood by him and desire for the life Adanna represented. He began staying late at work, claiming extra assignments, when in reality he was enjoying stolen moments with Adanna in her father's office lounge. Though nothing physical had happened yet, the emotional lines were already being crossed. Amara sensed the shift but chose silence, hoping it was just pressure from work. She noticed he now criticized her food, complained about the small apartment, and compared her tailoring to big designers he saw on Instagram. The man who once told her she was his piece now looked at her, as though she were the reason for his frustration. And though Amara's heart trembled with fear, she still prayed for him at night, asking God to strengthen their bond. She had no idea that the storm was already gathering, and that the vows she held so sacred were on the brink of betrayal. By the third year of their marriage, Amara had begun to feel a growing distance she could not explain. Chinedu was no longer the man who once rushed home to share every detail of his day, nor was he the man who laughed at her silly jokes while they cooked together. Instead, he became withdrawn, often irritable, and constantly dissatisfied. He complained about everything: their neighborhood, the noisy children who played football outside, the electricity issues, even the smell of kerosene from Amara's stove. His words, once filled with tenderness, now cut like knives. He began saying things like, "Amara, is this how we'll keep living? Look at your mates, they are doing better than this tailoring. You should think bigger." At first, Amara took his words as encouragement, but soon she realized they were criticisms wrapped in frustration. He compared her cooking to expensive restaurants, her dresses to designers he saw on wealthy women, her entire existence to the life he now craved. She tried harder to please him, staying up late to sew more clothes, experimenting with new recipes, and even borrowing money to surprise him with a new shirt. But nothing seemed to satisfy him. When she brought him the shirt instead of gratitude, he remarked that it wasn't as fine as the ones he saw at his boss's house. Each comment chipped away at her spirit, yet she held on, believing this was just a phase. She confided in her best friend Ngozi, who advised her to pray harder and remind Chinedu of their love. And so she did, even as tears wet her pillow most nights. She loved him too much to believe he could truly change, not knowing that his heart was already slipping away from her. Meanwhile, Chinedu was sinking deeper into Adanna's world. She invited him to outings, private lunches, and even introduced him to her circle of wealthy friends. Each experience only highlighted what he lacked at home. When he saw Adanna step out of boutiques with shopping bags worth more than his annual salary, he convinced himself that Amara's simplicity was no longer enough for him. He began to resent her for being content with so little. What he failed to see was that Adanna's attention was not born out of genuine affection, but of thrill. The thrill of taking what belonged to another, the thrill of testing how far her charm could go. She was a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted, and for now, she wanted Chinedu. The cracks in his marriage widened when he started making excuses to avoid intimacy with Amara. He claimed he was tired, stressed, or had early meetings, but in reality, his mind was consumed by Adanna. Amara tried to reignite the spark, dressing more beautifully, cooking his favorite meals, but he only grew colder. One night, after a long silence, she whispered, "Nkem, have I done something wrong?" He turned to her and said with a sigh, "Amara, I just feel like we're not moving forward. I need more from life, and I don't know if you can give me that." The words pierced her heart like a spear, but she swallowed her pain and replied softly, "I will stand by you, Chinedu. Whatever it takes, I will." She believed love was enough to heal any wound, but Chinedu's heart was already wandering far beyond her reach. The foundation of their marriage was shaking, and Amara was the only one still trying to hold it up. Chinedu had been trying to juggle two worlds, one where he was still Amara's husband, living in their modest Surulere apartment, and another where he was Adanna's companion, basking in luxury he could not afford on his own. But soon, the tension between both lives began to suffocate him. One Friday evening, after a long week at the office, his boss, Mr. Okafor, invited him for a late-night drink in his private lounge. The place smelled of imported cigars and aged whiskey, the kind of indulgence Chinedu had only seen in films. They sat across from each other, silence heavy between them, until Mr. Okafor leaned back and said, "Chinedu, you're a smart man. You know why my daughter likes you, don't you?" Chinedu froze, unsure how to respond. His boss smiled knowingly, swirling his glass. "You're hardworking, focused, and unlike the boys in her circle, you have drive. Adanna deserves a man who can keep up with her, not these spoiled rich brats. But I must be honest, she cannot continue being with a man who is already married." The words dropped like thunder in Chinedu's chest. Mr. Okafor's tone was calm, but carried the weight of finality. It was an ultimatum disguised as advice. Chinedu nodded silently, his heart pounding as visions of the life he could gain if he chose Adanna flashed through his mind. Promotions, connections, wealth, a seat at the table of the powerful. But standing in stark contrast was Amara, the woman who had stitched his torn shirts, prayed with him through sleepless nights, and sacrificed her dreams for his. His conscience wavered, but ambition screamed louder. The ride home that night was a blur. He sat in silence, staring out of the taxi window, while Lagos's neon lights mocked him with flashes of what he could never give Amara. That night, as Amara slept peacefully beside him, Chinedu lay awake, replaying his boss's words. She cannot continue being with a man who is already married. The choice before him was clear, but it was one that threatened to shatter the very vows he had once held sacred. The following weeks were a torment of indecision. Adanna, sensing the pressure from her father, began dropping hints about their future together. She talked about traveling to Dubai for honeymoon shopping, living in Banana Island, and starting businesses under her father's name. Each word lured Chinedu further away from reality, feeding his hunger for power and recognition. At the same time, Amara noticed his restlessness but misread it as financial stress. She prayed harder, cooked his favorite meals, and even began making plans to expand her tailoring kiosk into a small shop with the little savings she had managed to keep. One evening, as she presented him with her plans, excitedly explaining how she wanted to register her brand officially, Chinedu snapped. "Amara, do you think opening a small shop will change anything? Look around. This is Lagos. You think tailoring will ever put us among the people that matter?" His words crushed her, but she still tried to smile through the tears welling in her eyes. "Nkem, I only wanted to ease your burden. I believe we can grow little by little." He turned away muttering, "Little by little won't take us anywhere." That night marked the beginning of the end. Amara, in her innocence, thought he was simply frustrated. But in truth, Chinedu had already made up his mind. The ultimatum had taken root in him, and he was ready to exchange loyalty for luxury. The day Chinedu filed for divorce was one Amara would never forget. She had woken up early, preparing yam porridge with the last bit of palm oil she had, humming softly as she sewed a client's outfit. When Chinedu walked in with a stiff expression and handed her an envelope, she thought it was perhaps a surprise letter, or maybe good news from work. But as her eyes scanned the words, her hands began to tremble. Petition for dissolution of marriage. She looked up at him, her lips quivering. Chinedu, what is this? His gaze was cold, almost unfamiliar. Amara, I can't do this anymore. We've been stuck in the same place for years. I need a better life, and you can't give me that. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, tears spilling freely. A better life? After everything we've been through? After all the nights I prayed, the sacrifices I made? Chinedu, is this what you call love? But he didn't flinch. Instead, he muttered, love doesn't pay bills. Love doesn't open doors. I'm tired of struggling. I want more. His words stabbed deeper than any knife could. She crawled toward him, clutching his trousers, begging him to reconsider. Please don't do this. I am your wife. I stood by you when you had nothing. Don't throw us away. But Chinedu's heart was hardened, his mind clouded by visions of Adanna and the world she promised him. He pried her hands off gently and walked out, leaving Amara crumpled on the floor, her sobs echoing through the room like a dirge. The weeks that followed were hell for Amara. Neighbors whispered, friends pitted, and family members scolded her for not keeping her husband. But she bore the shame in silence, her heart bleeding with every passing day. She replayed their love story in her mind, searching for where she went wrong. Was she not beautiful enough? Not ambitious enough? Not good enough? But deep down, she knew the truth. This was not her failure but Chinedu's choice. The divorce process was swift, as though Chinedu wanted to erase her from his life quickly. At the final hearing, she signed the papers with shaking hands, tears blurring her vision. Chinedu didn't even look at her. His eyes were fixed ahead, already dreaming of his new life. When it was over, Amara walked out of the court feeling like a part of her had died. The man she had given her youth, her love, and her loyalty had discarded her like old clothing. That night, as she lay on her empty bed, she wept until her body shook, whispering to herself, God, please give me strength. It was betrayal written in ink, sealed by ambition, and carried out with cruelty. Chinedu had closed the chapter of their love, not knowing he was opening the book of his own downfall. For weeks after the divorce, Amara lived in a haze of sorrow. Her sewing machine sat untouched, her shop remained closed, and her once bright smile disappeared. She barely ate, surviving on water and occasional bread brought by her friend Ngozi. Depression lurked at her doorstep, threatening to consume her completely. But one morning, as she sat staring at the half-finished dress on her table, she remembered her mother's words before she passed. Amara, when life breaks you, don't stay broken. So your pieces back together, just like fabric. Those words struck her deeply, and for the first time in weeks, she wiped her tears, adjusted her chair, and began to sew. The whirring of the machine became her therapy, each stitch a reminder that her life was not over. Slowly, she began to reopen her kiosk, attending to old clients who had missed her work. Though she carried pain in her heart, she forced herself to smile, to push through. She realized that if she stayed broken, Chinedu's betrayal would have won. So she chose to fight, not for him, but for herself. As days turned into months, Amara's resilience began to bear fruit. Word spread about her skillful designs and neat finishing. A client recommended her to another, and soon she was sewing for people outside her neighborhood. Her once small kiosk began to attract customers from different parts of Lagos. She saved diligently, refusing to spend frivolously, until she was able to expand her kiosk into a proper shop. With Ngozi's encouragement, she even began to brand her work, creating simple labels that read, by Amara. Each step forward was painful, but it was also healing. She still thought of Chinedu sometimes, especially when she saw couples walking hand in hand, but instead of breaking down, she whispered, I will be fine. Though her heart was scarred, she was determined to rise again. She did not know that fate was already preparing to reward her strength in ways that would one day make Chinedu weep for the choices he made. Amara's shop, though small, soon became the talk of her area. Customers loved her attention to detail, her patience, and the way she listened carefully before cutting fabric. She treated every dress as if it were the most important piece she had ever made, and that earned her loyalty beyond measure. One afternoon, while she was adjusting the hem of a senator's kaftan, a woman of striking elegance walked in. She introduced herself as Madame Ifeoma, the wife of a prominent politician. She had seen Amara's work on one of her church members, and wanted a gown urgently for an event. Nervous but determined, Amara stayed up all night sewing, her hands moving tirelessly as tears occasionally blurred her vision. By dawn, the dress was ready, a masterpiece that fit Madame Ifeoma like it was made from her soul. The politician's wife was so impressed that she not only paid triple, but also recommended Amara to her circle of wealthy friends. That single opportunity became a floodgate of blessings. Within months, Amara's shop grew busier than ever, and she had to employ 2 apprentices to keep up with demand. Her name began to circulate in whispers of admiration across Lagos's elite women. Invitations came from high-profile clients, and slowly, Amara began to stand on her feet, not just financially but emotionally. She was learning to smile again, to laugh genuinely, to see herself not as a victim but as a survivor. For every stitch she made, she reminded herself, betrayal had broken her, but resilience had sewn her back stronger. Meanwhile, news of Chinedu's engagement to Adanna began spreading. It was on social media, splashed with pictures of Adanna showing off her diamond ring. Neighbors who once pitied Amara now watched her closely, expecting her to break down again, but she held her head high. Deep inside, she still felt the sting of betrayal, but she refused to let it cripple her. She had too many orders to fill, too many dreams to pursue. At night, she prayed, not for Chinedu's return, but for the strength to keep walking her own path. She knew life had a way of balancing itself, and she believed in God's timing. As for Chinedu, he was basking in his new life. Adanna showered him with expensive gifts, introduced him to influential friends, and paraded him proudly. He wore tailored suits, drove flashy cars, and dined at places he once could only dream of. He looked at himself in the mirror and told himself he had finally arrived. But somewhere deep inside, a small, quiet voice reminded him of Amara's soft hands, her gentle prayers, and the peace she gave him. He silenced that voice with expensive wine and Adanna's laughter, convincing himself he had made the right choice. But fate was already writing a story he could not escape. At first, life with Adanna felt like paradise. Chinedu had everything he thought he wanted: money, influence, and luxury. He wore designer suits to meetings, drove a sleek black Range Rover, and lived in a mansion with marble floors and chandeliers. Friends who once mocked his humble beginnings now envied him. But slowly, the cracks began to appear. Adanna was not Amara. She was beautiful, yes, but her beauty came with arrogance and entitlement. She spent recklessly, often demanding money for shopping sprees and trips abroad. When Chinedu tried to reason with her, she would laugh in his face and say, "My father's money will always cover us. Stop thinking like a poor man." Her words stung, but he swallowed his pride. He reminded himself that this was the price of wealth, that this was the life he chose. But in quiet moments, when the house was silent, or when he saw couples laughing freely in public, he thought of Amara. He remembered the way she used to sit with him outside their small apartment, fanning him against the heat, or the way she packed his lunch with notes of encouragement. Those memories haunted him, gnawing at his conscience. But each time regret tried to rise, he pushed it down with another glass of expensive whiskey, telling himself there was no going back. Adanna's true colors began to show more vividly when she openly disrespected him. She mocked his background in front of her friends, calling him village boy trying to act rich. At social gatherings, she flirted shamelessly with other men, leaving Chinedu humiliated. When he confronted her once, she snapped, "Don't forget who you are, Chinedu. Without me you are nothing. My father made you, and my father can unmake you." The words hit him like thunder. For the first time, he realized he was not a husband in his marriage, but an accessory, an ornament in Adanna's display of power. He began to feel trapped, suffocated by the very life he had chosen. Meanwhile, Amara's star was rising higher. Her brand was now recognized by society women, and her designs were featured at major weddings and events. Photos of her clients circulated online, tagged with by Amara, earning her recognition far beyond her neighborhood. Strangers began to seek her out, and her confidence grew daily. One evening, as she closed her shop, she looked up at the sky and whispered, "Lord, thank you for carrying me." While Chinedu struggled under the weight of his choices, Amara was finding freedom in hers. The announcement of Chinedu and Adanna's wedding shook Lagos's social scene. It was hyped as the wedding of the year, with preparations dripping in extravagance. Luxury decorators were hired, international caterers booked, and designers flown in. Every magazine and gossip blog had something to say about it. Chinedu walked through the preparations like a man in a dream, surrounded by opulence yet strangely hollow inside. He smiled at the cameras, posed with Adanna at pre-wedding shoots, and nodded when wedding planners made suggestions. But when he was alone, he felt a gnawing emptiness he could not explain. The closer the wedding drew, the more restless he became. He drank more heavily, telling himself it was just nerves. Adanna, on the other hand, basked in the spotlight. She loved the attention, the hype, the endless compliments. To her, the wedding was not about love but about status, a stage to show off her wealth and power. Chinedu saw this but convinced himself it was just her nature. He told himself love would grow later, that peace would come after. Yet in quiet moments, his thoughts drifted back to Amara. He imagined what life would have been if he had stayed, if they had built slowly, little by little, as she always said. But it was too late. He was in too deep. Meanwhile, fate was weaving its threads. Amara received a call from one of Adanna's bridesmaids, who had admired her work at an event. She wanted Amara to design her gown for the wedding. Amara accepted without knowing whose wedding it was, grateful for the business. She poured her heart into the design, creating a gown that glowed with elegance. When she delivered it, the bridesmaid was overjoyed, promising to recommend Amara to more of her wealthy friends. Amara left that day with a smile, never imagining that her work would be displayed at the very wedding of her ex-husband. Destiny was playing its quiet game, aligning paths that were meant to collide. While Chinedu rehearsed his vows with unease, and Adanna basked in her princess-like glory, Amara was unknowingly sewing her way back into the story, this time not as a broken wife, but as a woman reborn in strength. The stage was being set for a drama none of them could foresee, one that would shake the foundation of everything Chinedu thought he had gained. The week before the wedding was filled with chaos disguised as luxury. Wedding planners barked orders into phones, decorators hung crystals from ceilings, and makeup artists rehearsed bridal looks on Adanna. The mansion was buzzing like a beehive, yet Chinedu moved through it like a ghost. He had the clothes, the cars, the attention, but he lacked peace. At night, he tossed in bed beside Adanna, staring at the ceiling as memories of Amara crept in uninvited. He remembered the quiet warmth of their home, the way she would bring him hot pap when he had no appetite, or how she would pray over him before interviews. He remembered the day she cried silently when he accused her of being dead weight, and guilt stabbed him like a knife. Now, as he lay in silk sheets, surrounded by excess, he felt empty. He asked himself questions he didn't dare say aloud. Is this love? Or am I just playing a role in Adanna's show? But each morning, the world expected him to smile, to pose for photographs, and to be the charming groom-to-be. And so he buried his restlessness in expensive whiskey, hoping numbness would quiet the storm. Adanna, on the other hand, was in her element. Every day, she paraded herself in new outfits, recording clips for social media with captions like "Countdown to Forever with My King." But deep down, even Chinedu could sense that she loved the spotlight more than she loved him. Once, when he asked why she wanted such an extravagant wedding, she snapped, "Because people must know who I am. This wedding is not just for me, it's for our name. It's for the history books." Chinedu realized then that his life had become a performance. He was not marrying for love but for power, status, and ego. Yet he lacked the courage to pull back. Meanwhile, Amara was thriving. Her designs had earned her invitations to showcase at 2 major events, and her apprentices were now handling clients she once could not imagine. But she had no idea her past and present were about to collide violently. When one of her clients mentioned she would be attending Adanna's grand wedding, Amara smiled politely, unaware that the groom she was about to hear whispered on everyone's lips was the very man who had broken her. Destiny was leading them into the same room again, but this time, the power balance was shifting. The bridal shower was the first time Amara's name floated into the wedding atmosphere. Adanna and her friends gathered in a luxury hotel suite, sipping champagne as they admired their outfits. One of the bridesmaids twirled in her gown, giggling, "I can't believe how perfect this is. The tailor is amazing, Amara, that's her name. You all should try her work." The room went quiet for a second. Adanna's face hardened, though she quickly covered it with a smile. She knew exactly who Amara was. Her pride burned at the thought of her fiancé's ex-wife being praised within her circle. "That name should never be mentioned here again," she snapped coldly. The bridesmaids exchanged uneasy glances, realizing Adanna's temper had been triggered. But gossip has a way of traveling, and soon, more guests began arriving with dresses tagged by Amara. The name spread like wildfire, whispered with admiration. Adanna tried to dismiss it, but she could not escape it. At the rehearsal dinner, even the MC mentioned that some of the ladies were shining in Lagos's rising star designer's gowns, Amara. Chinedu's hands froze on his wine glass when he heard it. He hadn't heard her name spoken in months. It was like a ghost had entered the room, stirring emotions he thought he had buried. That night, when the crowd dispersed, Chinedu sat alone in his car, replaying the name in his mind, Amara. His chest tightened as guilt washed over him. He wondered if she was doing well, if she had forgiven him, if she had found happiness. He scrolled through his phone, resisting the urge to check her social media, but the longing gnawed at him. For the first time, he questioned whether walking away had been worth it. He had wealth, but he lacked peace. He had luxury, but he lacked love. He looked at Adanna, who was laughing loudly with her friends, and his heart felt heavy. Meanwhile, Amara, at that very moment, was kneeling in her small living room, thanking God for another day. She had no idea her name had unsettled her ex-husband in the middle of his extravagant wedding plans. She had no idea that the tables of destiny were beginning to turn. The wedding day dawned with golden sunlight spilling over Lagos. Streets were blocked with convoys of exotic cars, photographers swarmed the venue, and security lined the gates. Guests arrived in glittering attires, women in sequin gowns, men in starched igbatas and caps. It was the talk of the city, an event designed to show power and wealth. Adanna, dressed in an imported gown with diamond embroidery, sparkled as she posed for endless photographs. She was radiant, but her eyes glimmered with something more dangerous than love, pride. Chinedu, dressed in an Italian tuxedo, walked stiffly beside her. He smiled for the cameras, but inside, he was a man divided. Every cheer, every clap, every blessing felt heavy. He remembered his mother's words before she died. "Son, never choose wealth over peace. Money without peace is poison." Those words echoed in his head as he looked around at the grand celebration. The irony was bitter. He had left a woman who gave him peace for a woman who gave him spectacle. Now, in the middle of his so-called dream, he felt emptier than ever. When the officiating minister asked if anyone objected to the union, the room fell silent, but Chinedu's mind screamed. He wanted to raise his hand, to scream that he wasn't ready, that he wasn't sure, but fear held him bound. Instead, he swallowed his truth and said, "I do." The crowd erupted in cheers, cameras flashed, and music filled the hall. Yet deep inside, Chinedu felt like a prisoner who had just locked his own chains. Outside the glittering venue, Amara was at her shop, fitting a client for a reception gown. She laughed with her apprentices, her face glowing with peace. She had no idea that in a hall just miles away, her name had been whispered with envy, that her ex-husband was tying himself into a bond he already regretted, and that fate was setting up the moment they would meet again. The city celebrated a wedding, but destiny was quietly sharpening its knife. The first weeks after the wedding felt like stepping into a palace of mirrors. Everything glittered, but everything was fragile. Adanna's appetite for luxury only grew. She wanted weekend trips to Dubai, private shopping in Paris, and endless parties filled with friends who only cared about her father's money. Chinedu became a trophy, dragged from one event to another, expected to smile, nod, and look the part of a wealthy husband. But behind closed doors, reality was different. Adanna belittled him whenever he failed to meet her impossible standards. "Why are you so slow? You don't walk like a billionaire's husband," she would sneer. The words pierced Chinedu's pride, but he bit his tongue, remembering the status he had chosen over love. Yet the more she mocked him, the more his thoughts drifted to Amara, the woman who once told him he was enough, even when he had nothing. The memory tormented him, making his nights sleepless. Meanwhile, rumors began to circulate. Some of Adanna's friends whispered about her spending too much, others hinted that she was growing bored of Chinedu already. The cracks in their glass castle widened with every passing day, and though Chinedu tried to patch them with silence, he knew the walls were about to shatter. One night, after another quarrel, Chinedu drove aimlessly through Lagos until his car stopped outside a familiar neighborhood, Surulere. His heart raced as he stared at the road that once led him home. He longed to see Amara, to at least apologize, but shame held him back. He knew he had no right to knock on her door after what he had done. Still, he sat there for hours, battling guilt and regret, until finally he drove away. Unknown to him, destiny was arranging for their paths to cross again. Amara's brand had recently caught the eye of a wealthy client, none other than Chief Okonkwo's business rival's wife. When she requested Amara to design her outfit for an upcoming corporate banquet, Amara agreed without hesitation. What she didn't know was that the banquet would be the very stage where her past, her present, and Chinedu's choices would collide with explosive consequences. The banquet hall glittered with chandeliers, laughter, and clinking glasses. It was one of those gatherings where wealth was paraded like a crown. Chinedu walked in with Adanna on his arm, her gown glistening under the lights. She strutted proudly, eager to outshine every other woman in the room. But whispers began as soon as they entered. Across the hall, women gasped in admiration at one particular gown, sleek, elegant, a masterpiece of tailoring. "Who made it?" they asked. The answer came like a drumbeat: Amara. Chinedu froze when he heard the name, his chest tightening. Adanna's smile faltered. She turned sharply to one of her friends and demanded, "Who said that name here?" But it was too late. The ripple had spread. One by one, women began showing off their Amara-designed gowns, praising her craftsmanship. Chinedu's rival's wife proudly declared, "Amara is the rising queen of fashion in Lagos. If you're not wearing her, you're behind." The room erupted in applause, and Chinedu felt a lump in his throat. The woman he had abandoned for status had now become the talk of the elite, right under his nose. Adanna, however, was not impressed. She was humiliated. Jealousy darkened her face as she hissed to Chinedu, "Is this not your ex-wife? The tailor everyone is praising? How dare she show her face in my circle?" But her anger only exposed her insecurity. Guests began whispering, some smirking at the irony. Adanna had stolen another woman's husband, yet it was that very woman's name now glowing on every tongue. Chinedu excused himself and stepped outside, his heart pounding. He thought of Amara's resilience, her strength, her ability to rise from ashes without bitterness. He realized then that he had traded diamonds for dust. The banquet ended with Adanna in a foul mood, snapping at everyone, while Chinedu drove home in silence, his soul heavy with regret. He knew the truth now. Wealth without peace was poison, and pride without love was ruin. Months later, the inevitable happened. Adanna's pride, her reckless spending, and her temper drove a wedge between her and Chinedu. Their arguments became public scandals, with Adanna once slapping him in front of guests during a heated quarrel. Chief Okonkwo, furious that his daughter had embarrassed the family name, withdrew his support, cutting them off financially. Suddenly, the cars were gone, the mansion was sold, and Chinedu found himself living in a rented apartment once again. The marriage that was supposed to secure his future had crumbled like sandcastles against the tide. Adanna eventually packed her things and left, running back to her father's house, leaving Chinedu alone with his shame. The wedding had been grand, but in truth, it had ended the very day it began, with emptiness. Meanwhile, Amara's star only rose higher. Her fashion label expanded into a full boutique, her designs were featured in magazines, and she began traveling for shows across Africa. She lived simply but joyfully, surrounded by love from her apprentices, clients, and a new circle of supportive friends. One day, fate brought Chinedu to her boutique. He stood outside, watching her laugh with a client, her glow brighter than ever. Shame chained his feet, but he whispered to himself, "She won." He turned away, too broken to face her, and walked into the Lagos heat, realizing he had lost the only woman who ever truly loved him. Amara, sensing nothing, continued smiling inside, her life a testimony of resilience. The poetic justice was complete. He had divorced her to marry his boss's daughter, but the wedding had never truly ended as planned. Instead, it ended with his downfall and her triumph. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and put on post notifications.